Here is the Columbia River. This is the east, so this is the part where obviously rivers are flowing into the Columbia. And here's the gorge. And then here is the Columbia where it's headed towards the Pacific. That bridge you see in the middle is I-90. So I-90 goes all the way from Boston, all the way across the country. What's amazing to me is how much this river probably flowed prior to all the dams that we've placed on this river in order to irrigate all the farms. Hey, welcome back to Roadworthy. I'm Sarah. So the thumbnail in the earlier footage was a little bit of a tease. I was supposed to be out and about camping and hiking, but I had van issues that needed to be dealt with, and I was like, oh my God, forget it, I'm going home. So instead of this week's weekly reads being from the top of a mountain, I'm here in my local park. The first book I read this week was Dead Girls by Selva Armada, translated by Annie McDermott. This book was originally published in 2014 and is described as a nonfiction novel in similar vein to Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. And in this book, Armada details the deaths of three young women, Sarita, Andrea, and Maria Luisa. And their stories are interspersed with other cases of violence against women and girls, as well as Selva's own experiences as a woman growing up in rural Argentina. And a lot of what this book does is really paint a picture of the normalization of violence against women and girls, the objectification of women and girls, the sort of the patriarchy and misogyny that is systemic, at least in rural Argentina, where she focuses on in this book. It's also interesting, she talks a lot about the intersection with class and poverty. The way the book is written is, again, the cases of these three girls are interspersed with details of the deaths of or the abuse of lots of other women and girls. And I think partly what that does is really gives the reader this sense that violence against women and girls is pervasive, that it happens all the time. And then the original stories that she's focusing on are from the 80s, but some of these other stories that she intersperses in there are from later, from the 90s, for example. And so it just gives you this sense of this is happening pervasively, and that sort of misogyny is normalized. The tone of this book is it's cold, it's distant, it's very matter of fact. For me, I found that very effective. I think it helps distance the reader from the events that she's describing, so that the reader's not overwhelmed with these facts and details and these horrible stories. It helps give the reader a little bit of distance from these events as well. I think for me, at least, the coldness of this tone to me felt like Armada's the undercurrent of frustration and anger about these events being, in most cases, not even really investigated. And it still continues on to this day. And so again, I think her frustration and anger really comes through in that cold and distant tone. So the next thing I finished was The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. I've never read anything by Cisneros, and she is recognized as a leader of the Chicano literature movement that really kicked off in the 80s. Interestingly, this book was originally written in 1984 and was really a side project for Cisneros. She was at the Iowa's Writer Workshop for poetry, and she felt like she was really struggling to find her own voice. Might be putting words in her mouth, but at least how I interpreted her comments, were that she felt like she was being taught to write for a white audience. And that just felt inauthentic to her, and she really wanted to write about her own experiences as a Mexican American, and write about those experiences in a way that other Mexican Americans would recognize. And so she was writing this book on the side for herself. So the way this book is structured is very small vignettes or chapters. So here you go. 2-3 pages. And what a lot of these stories or vignettes are really about growing up poor, growing up ashamed, it's a lot of coming of age vignettes. There's also vignettes about family, about friends, and so when you put all these little vignettes together, what Cisneros really does is create, sort of this pastiche of stories about really her whole community. So it's the grocery store, it's the boys hanging out on the curb kind of a thing. And so you really get this sense of what this whole community was like for her growing up. You also get little snippets of patriarchy and how oftentimes the women in the community are complicit in enforcing the patriarchy. Even in a 1-2 page, a little 2-page thing, I felt like Cisneros was really able to convey an emotional intensity and residency. This book is so vibrant, and again, you really get a sense of this living, thriving community somewhere in Chicago, and it's delightful. Cisneros is largely known as a poet. And she has written 2 novels, and again, this is her first one. Interestingly, I learned when this was re-released in 2009, she was the first Chicano female author, to be published by a major publishing house in 2009. So that was kind of shocking that it's so late, but let's not get into that aside. But anyway, this was just a real delight and a real charmer. And if you've not picked it up, I really encourage you to. Again, it's an important work, but again, delightful. So the last thing that I read was The Escape Artist by Jonathan Freedland. This is this details Rudolf Verba's escape from Auschwitz in 1944. He and a buddy, Alfred Wetzler, were the first Jews to actually escape from Auschwitz. First half really details Verba's experiences in Auschwitz, how he ended up in Auschwitz, the various jobs that he had, and his increasing passion to escape from Auschwitz, starting to feel a duty to warn other Jews about what was going on. So that's sort of the first half of the book, which for me was a little bit draggy, in the sense that there's not necessarily new information here. If you've read anything about Auschwitz before, even in novels, a lot of the things that are being described here are not new. But you know, if you aren't very familiar with how Auschwitz and Birkenau were operated, this would definitely be very instructive. The second half of the book really details Verba and Wetzler's escape, and their journey from Poland to Slovakia, and their ultimately meeting with the leaders of the Slovak Jewish Council. And the leaders of that council and Verba and Wetzler go ahead and generate a 33-page report that does become known as the Verba-Wetzler Report, documenting the details of the operations of Auschwitz, and also the estimates of the numbers of people that were being executed. It then also goes through the details of them trying to distribute this report. Verba's goal, again, was always to get it into the hands of Jews, thinking that if you sort of warned Jews what was happening, they wouldn't get on the trains. And so there's a lot about what happened to this report. It also details how the report eventually got into the hands of Churchill, the Pope, FDR, and again, sort of their reactions to this report. And then it launches into sort of the post-war years. You know, what happened to Verba, you know, marriage, family, professionally, and really the impact of his imprisonment and his frustrations about what happened to the Verba-Wetzler report, what did and didn't happen. And to me, that second half of the book was much more interesting because it was new. I was aware of their report, but, you know, again, just learning those details about what happened and, you know, it changing hands and getting translated and all of that, I thought was very interesting. This book has an obvious comparison to a 2019 book, The Volunteer, written by Jack Fairweather. That book was about Witold Pilecki, who was a Polish resistance leader, spy, who, as the title would suggest, volunteered to be imprisoned in Auschwitz. He was there from 1940 to 1943. To me, that book in some ways was much more interesting because, you know, Pilecki's life was as a spy, as a you know, part of the Polish underground. And so he had a career before being in Auschwitz, and had a career after. When he escaped in 1943, he was still part of the Polish resistance. And so that book gave a little bit of a broader picture of sort of what was going on, not only in Auschwitz, but what were people doing who were outside of Auschwitz. So I think both books together are interesting, you know, sort of companion reads. One, both those books really impress upon the reader that your likelihood of surviving a concentration camp was just sheer dumb luck. That there's so many experiences that both of these men had that, you know, if they went right instead of left, they would have been killed. A lot of it comes down to being in the right place at the right time. The other thing that both of these books do together is really go into, you know, the politics of what to do with this information. You know, some people feared, you know, if they shared this information, would you be angering the Nazis and actually make the situation for Jews worse? You know, there were secret negotiations going on to get Jews escape, right? Would you jeopardize that? You know, FDR and Churchill were both concerned about the larger aims of the war. So, you know, so again, it's what to do with the information was complicated. And so both of these books really drill that home. So again, I think both of these books together, both The Escape Artist and The Volunteer, are interesting books to read together. So that is what I finished this week. What am I currently reading? I am currently reading a Booktube prize book, so I won't talk about that. But I'm also listening to an audiobook, Demon Copperhead, and I think I'm about halfway through at this point. So I won't say too much more about that. And I am looking to start The Daughters of Yalta here in the next day or so as part of my Booktube at War reading for the month of July. So since I finished The Escape Artist, which I suppose counts as a Booktube at War book too, you know, finish that nonfiction, so it's time to pick up another nonfiction. So that's what I've got going on this week. So hope you're having a good week. Hope you're having weather that's as beautiful as ours. Hope you're reading some good books, and I will talk to you again soon. See ya.